Hello and welcome to this tutorial on how to paint non-metallic metal gold. For this gold, the colors I've used are Vallejo Model Color Black, Dark Sea Blue, Flat Earth, Vallejo Model Air, Armor Brown, and Citadel Uriel Yellow, and also Golden Acrylics Titanium White. So first off, I have painted the shoulder pad in a mix between Flat Earth and Dark Sea Blue. Next up, I start getting in some initial highlights using pure Flat Earth, just trying to mimic the shape of the shoulder pad and at the same time follow the shape of the wings on the Aquila. I mainly do this to help me get a feel for where the highlights are placed and in a way that I can repair very easily. I also do it because once I start adding the stronger highlights, I have a good foundation for blending the colors easily with glazes later on, as you will see in this here tutorial. At this point you can't really see a lot of progress, but this actually helps me, this step actually helps me a lot with preparations for this step. So at this point I add titanium white and a little bit of the Uriel yellow. The yellow helps to keep the saturation rather high and not desaturate the flat earth too much. I'm trying to build up an opaque layer in this mixture, make it easier to cover with the even brighter highlight in the next step. From this point, I just try to keep on working on putting the highlight color down where I put the flat earth in the last segment. So I just sped up the footage so you don't get too bored watching my hand go back and forth over the same areas all the time. And here you have the results of this step. So at this step I add more titanium white to the mix and a little bit more of the Uriel yellow. And just keep working, this time in a smaller area than in the last step, but still keeping to the shapes. And also I try and start putting in some of the edge highlights at this point of the process. And here you can see the results of this step. Now it's really starting to take shape and you can see a lot of progress. So for this next step right here, we are going to blend these previous highlight tones in with the base color. So I've made a mix of the base color, the first mix I used, and the highlight color from the previous step, and thin them down with a lot of water, so it's down to almost looks like tea. And just working over the transition, I like to go back and forth a little bit. So I might start going from the highlight to the mid-tone first and then go the other way, so you'll see a lot of back and forth. Just keep in mind to not have too much of this on your brush, because it'll just run out all over the shoulder pad. And let every layer of the glaze dry before you start working in that area again. And here you can see the results of blending this with the glazes. And as you can see, we're really starting to get a nice and rather smooth transition for this one. But I really want to smooth out the transition even further, so I'm making a little bit darker mix and going over the outer parts of the highlights and the midtone to really get it to where I want it to be. So still doing glazes, but keeping it a little bit darker and just touching up the transition a little. So the process I use is really a lot of repetition and going back and forth. So for this step, well, just add a little bit more titanium white to your highlight mix and a little bit more of the yellow. I try and notch it up, just tiny steps at a time, so don't go crazy overboard, or, well, at least if you're trying to do it the same way I'm doing it. So tiny steps, add a little bit more of white for each step. At this point, I really don't think I need to explain what you're going to do. Just add a little bit more white and Uriel yellow to your mix. Really pushing the contrasts at this point. There will be another highlight step later on, but this is pretty much the last step before the extreme highlights come in later on. And at this point I really start doing the edge highlighting, and I try to move from spots of shadow to highlight points with this, dragging the brush towards the highest light of the object. I think it really starting to become really powerful gold at this point, so holding back on highlighting anymore. And now I'm starting to draw in some shadows. So for this step there's a considerable amount of dark sea blue added to the flat earth. And some black as well. Just a tiny amount, because you don't need really that much. So I start working in shadows and also working on getting some dark lines done. And for this step I try to keep the paint consistency somewhere between very light layer consistency and glaze consistency, so it's a very transparent layer but still gives somewhat of coverage. And remember not to keep too much paint on your brush for this step. Now I've added a bit more of the dark sea blue and a bit more of the black, so it's more or less extremely dark bluish green, and doing the extreme shadows and continuing the dark lining. So the contrast is really starting to come together at this point for me, so now we are going to move on to the next step, which is glazing the transition from mid-tone to shadow tone. So all I've done here is add a bunch of water to the shadow tone and drag my brush from the mid-tone towards the shadow to even up. At this point, I'm starting to add the extreme highlights. I do this with a mix of titanium white and Uriel yellow. I'm trying to really control how much I use and only put this in tiny spots. So there will be a lot more of it on the front side, on the right front side of the shoulder guard. And on the back side it will just be a super tiny amount, and also on a couple of the edges to really keep the contrast high and to get some good definition and readability on the pauldron. And remember, just like before, don't take too much of this mix on your brush at the same time. Just take a bunch on your brush and wipe it off on some tissue. As you might remember from the beginning, there was some armor brown in this recipe, and this is the time to bring it out. So what I'm doing now is just glazing from mid-tone to shadow to give it a bit warmer mid-tones and a bit warmer shadows. As before with glazing, add a lot of water, get it into looking like tea, and make sure you don't have too much. I usually try my hand to see that the consistency is right, and make sure that there's not too much paint in the brush. So I wanted to keep the gold fairly desaturated, so it won't compete with the very saturated blue. But for me it was maybe a little bit too desaturated towards the highlights. So I decided to make a glaze of Uriel yellow to bring some color and some more kick to the highlight tones. So I'm getting pretty happy with my results here, but I feel like I want to add back some of the tone from the flat dark earth, so I made a glaze of that to get a bit more mint tone back here. So that's what I'm working with at this point. And because of all the glazing I've done, I've lost some of the extreme highlights a little bit, and also a lot of the edge highlights. So I'm just trying to get some of that back in this step, and also just touch up some little details that I messed up previously. So that's what this is about. And this is pretty much the last step for me in this one. now I am done with the gold. So this has been really awkward talking to myself. So I'm really hoping someone is watching this, even though it's over 35 minutes long. Here you can see the finished results and the cauldron. And yeah, well, I added some wood as well. I hope to see you again sometime. Thank you.